Her wealthy family ruthlessly mocked the seemingly ordinary, struggling single dad she was forced to marry, completely unaware they were laughing at Alexander Vargas, a billionaire titan hiding from the very society they worshipped. Christianah signed the marriage certificate the same way she handled every asset her father traded, quickly, coldly, and without looking at the details. She had learned early on that treating her own life like a balance sheet was the only way to survive the fallout. The sterile back office of the estate smelled of expensive cigars and lemon polish, the quiet offering a sharp contrast to the lavish, performative wedding reception happening just beyond the heavy oak doors. Out there, her father and his wealthy associates were currently drinking champagne, pointing, and laughing at her new husband's unassuming presence. Christianah sat stiffly in a heavy leather chair, the intricate lace of her off-the-shoulder gown and the heavy crystal tiara feeling more like a gilded cage than a celebration. Her pen glided across the dotted line with practiced elegance, securing a future she hadn't chosen, and she explicitly refused to look up at the man standing beside her. She could feel his eyes on her, though. She had noticed it from the moment they had been introduced, weeks ago, to settle her father's red ink. He didn't look at her the way the men in her world did. There was no arrogant appraisal, no cold calculation of her status or net worth. Even out there in the banquet hall, while her family openly snickered at him, his expression remained stoic and unbothered. He watched her the way someone does when they are truly paying attention. He watched her like he saw the exhaustion she was desperately trying to hide, like her quiet dignity actually meant something to him. The heavy oak doors of the estate closed behind them, finally cutting off the faint, cruel laughter of her relatives. The silence that followed was immediate and stark. As they walked down the sweeping driveway toward a sensible, dark blue sedan, a glaring anomaly among the rows of imported sports cars and chauffeured SUVs, Christianah gathered the voluminous skirts of her lace gown. She felt ridiculous, a porcelain doll packaged and shipped off to settle a ledger. Victor opened the passenger door for her, offering no exaggerated flourish, just a simple, steady hold of the handle to ensure she had enough room to maneuver the heavy tool in silk. He didn't offer his hand to help her in, sensing, perhaps, that she had been handled enough for one day and had no desire to be touched. Once inside, the engine turned over with a quiet, reliable hum. As they pulled away from the gilded gates of her father's world, Christianah braced herself. This was the moment the men in her circle usually began their lectures. She expected the transactional rundown, what was expected of her, how she should behave around his child, or perhaps a defensive justification of his own bruised ego after enduring her family's relentless mockery during the reception. She folded her hands tightly in her lap, staring blindly out the window at the passing streetlights, her emotional armor fully engaged. But the lecture never came. Miles slipped by in the dark, the transition from sprawling, aggressive estates to the tree-lined, unassuming roads of West Hartford, marked only by the rhythmic hum of the tires. Victor kept his eyes on the road. At one point, he reached over to the dashboard, but instead of turning on the radio to drown out the awkwardness, he quietly adjusted the climate control, angling the warm air slightly toward her shivering, bare shoulders. He did it seamlessly, without looking over to demand a nod of gratitude or a softer expression in return. Christianah allowed her white-knuckled grip on her own hands to loosen just a fraction. In her world, comfort was a commodity, something traded for obedience, a favor, or a smile. Every kindness had a hidden price tag, yet the man beside her in the unassuming suit jacket seemed entirely unconcerned with extracting anything from her. He wasn't trying to charm her, own her, or forcefully prove he was unaffected by the evening's humiliations. He was simply letting her breathe. She stole a brief glance at his profile, illuminated faintly by the dashboard lights. His jaw was relaxed, his focus steady. For the first time all evening, the tight, anxious knot in Christiana's chest began to slowly unravel. She had spent her entire life surrounded by wealthy men who demanded the room's attention, men whose massive entitlement took up all the oxygen. Victor, it seemed, was content to just share the space. As they turned onto a quiet residential street, Christianah realized with a faint flutter of uncertainty that she had absolutely no idea how to navigate a man who didn't want anything from her. The sedan came to a halt in front of a modest colonial home, its white siding gleaming softly under a yellow porch light. It was a far cry from the cold, marble-pillared fortress Christianah had left behind. Here, the air smelled of damp earth and freshly cut grass, not the suffocating perfume of old money and resentment. Victor killed the engine and turned to her. For a moment, his gaze lingered on the heavy tiara still perched in her hair. "She's likely still awake," he said, his voice dropping into a register of protective warmth she hadn't heard before. "She's been waiting." Christianah felt a fresh wave of anxiety. She had survived her father's boardrooms and her mother's social gauntlets, but a 5-year-old was a different kind of judge. She stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under her silk heels, her wedding dress feeling like an absurd costume in this quiet neighborhood. As they reached the front door, it swung open before Victor could reach for his keys. A small figure stood in the entryway, framed by the warm glow of the hallway. Lily was a whirlwind of energy suddenly stilled, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. She looked up at Christianah with wide, unblinking eyes that held the same terrifyingly observant quality as her father's. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of Christiana's uncertainty. She waited for the child to cry, to hide, or to reject the stranger her father had brought home. Instead, Lily took a tentative step forward, her gaze traveling from the hem of the lace gown all the way up to Christiana's hair. "You're very tall," Lily whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. Then she reached out a small, tentative hand and touched a long, dark strand of Christiana's hair that had escaped her updo. "And your hair is very long. It looks like it would get caught in things, like the vacuum." The blunt, practical assessment was so far removed from the scripted flattery Christianah was used to that she felt a genuine, startled laugh bubble up in her throat. The test wasn't about her pedigree or her poise. It was about the reality of living in a world where hair got caught in vacuums and silk dresses were just extra fabric. Victor's hand settled briefly on the small of Christiana's back, a light, grounding touch. "She likes it," he translated, a hint of a smile finally breaking through his stoic mask. "In Lily speak, that means you're interesting." Christianah looked down at the girl, then back at the man she had been forced to marry. For the first time, the arrangement felt less like a cage and more like a door she hadn't realized was open. The first morning in the house on West Hartford felt like waking up in a different world. There was no chime of a summoned servant or the sharp, impatient voice of her father demanding a breakfast briefing. Instead, there was only the soft, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock and the pale gold of the morning sun stretching across the hardwood floor. When Christianah finally ventured into the kitchen, she expected to find the remnants of a rushed morning, crumbs on the counter or the cold dregs of a pot. Instead, she found a single ceramic mug sitting on a cork coaster, steam still curled lazily from the dark liquid inside. Beside it was a small bowl of sugar and a splash of cream, exactly how she liked it, though she didn't remember telling him. She picked up the mug, the warmth seeping into her palms. It wasn't the bitter, over-roasted brew served at her father's boardroom meetings. It was rich and smooth. She leaned against the counter, listening to the muffled sounds of Victor helping Lily get ready for school upstairs. There were no orders being barked, just the low murmur of his voice and Lily's occasional high-pitched giggle. Later that afternoon, Christianah spread her design sketches across the small dining table. It was the one thing her father hadn't been able to take from her eye for textile patterns and the way colors bled into one another. She was lost in the curve of a floral motif when she sensed him enter the room. She braced herself for the usual critique, the "when will this hobby become a real business?" she had heard 1,000 times. But Victor didn't say a word. He walked past her to the kitchen to refill a glass of water, his steps quiet. As he returned, he paused, his gaze lingering on her work for a heartbeat longer than necessary. He reached out, not to touch the paper, but to adjust the blinds on the window behind her, angling them so the harsh glare of the afternoon sun no longer washed out the colors on her page. He didn't ask for her attention. He didn't offer a hollow compliment or tell her how to improve. He simply moved a lamp from the corner closer to her workspace, ensuring the light was perfect as the day began to fade. Christianah watched him disappear back into his small home office, the silence in the house feeling heavier, yet somehow more comfortable than before. In her world, help always came with a lecture on efficiency. Here, Victor moved through the day like a ghost of quiet support, noticing the small fractures in her comfort and mending them before she even realized they were there. It was a terrifyingly selfless kind of attention, and for the first time, she found herself looking forward to the next morning's coffee. The evening air was cooling, pulling the scent of pine through the cracked kitchen window. Lily had finally drifted off, leaving the house in a rare, heavy silence. Christianah sat at the wooden table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood, a far cry from the polished, cold mahogany she had been raised with. Victor was across from her, drying a plate with slow, methodical movements. "I keep waiting," she said, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. Victor paused, the towel still in his hand. He didn't turn around immediately, giving her the space to continue. "I keep waiting for the bill to arrive," she admitted, her gaze fixed on her own hands. In my world, men who agree to arrangements like this usually have a list. They want access to my father's connections, or they want a trophy to display at the right parties. I expected you to be a user. I expected you to start asking for favors the moment the ink was dry. Victor finally turned, leaning back against the counter. The soft yellow light of the kitchen cast long shadows, but his eyes were clear, devoid of the calculating glint she had spent her life avoiding. "Your father told me you were a liability he needed to move off his books," Victor said, his voice level and devoid of judgment. "He spoke about you like you were a piece of equipment that had stopped performing. But when I saw you in that dining room 3 weeks ago, I didn't see a liability." Christianah looked up, her pulse quickening. "What did you see?" He said, "I saw someone who was exhausted by the noise," he said simply. "I didn't agree to this because of your father's connections. I agreed because I'm raising a daughter in a world that tries to break people like you every single day. I don't need a socialite or a business partner. I wanted someone steady. I wanted someone kind. I wanted Lily to see that you can be under immense pressure and still choose to be gentle." He moved to the table, sitting in the chair opposite her, but he didn't reach for her hand. He respected the distance she had spent a lifetime building. "I don't want anything from your father, Christianah, and I don't want anything from you that you aren't willing to give. I just want a home where the person walking through the front door isn't looking for a way to win." The honesty in his voice was a physical weight. For the first time, the arrangement didn't feel like a debt she was paying off. It felt like a sanctuary she had been accidentally traded into. As she looked at him, the man her family had called a nobody, she realized the terrifying truth. The nobody was the only person who had ever truly seen her. The afternoon was quiet. The only sound the soft click of Christianah's keyboard and the distant rhythmic chirping of a bird in the backyard. She was immersed in a series of floral patterns, trying to capture the exact shade of the hydrangeas she had seen near the porch. The domestic peace she had found over the last few weeks felt fragile, like a glass ornament she was terrified of dropping. But for the first time in years, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. A sharp ping from her laptop broke the silence. A news alert banner slid into the top right corner of her screen, a routine notification from a financial journal she had forgotten to unsubscribe from. Usually, she swiped them away without a glance, but a name in the headline caught her eye like a physical blow. Vargas Capital Group closes landmark $4 billion acquisition. Founder Alexander Vargas remains reclusive. Christianah froze, her breath hitching in her throat. Vargas. It was the name her father had whispered with a mixture of terror and awe during his late-night rants about his debts. She clicked the link, her heart hammering against her ribs. The page loaded, revealing a high-resolution photograph from a gala 3 years prior. The man in the image was dressed in a tuxedo that probably cost more than her father's car. He looked cold, imposing, and utterly untouchable, a titan of industry whose movements dictated the flow of global markets. It was the man currently in the garage fixing Lily's broken bicycle. She stared at the screen, her eyes burning as she read the subheadline. Vargas, whose personal net worth is estimated at $19 billion, continues to run his empire from undisclosed locations. The room seemed to tilt. The modest consultant who made her coffee exactly how she liked it, the man who had adjusted the blinds to protect her eyesight, the poor single dad her family had laughed at until they were red in the face. He was a ghost, a fabrication. She looked around the kitchen, her gaze falling on the ceramic mug he had left for her that morning. It sat there, unassuming and honest, yet everything about it now felt like a calculation. The $4 billion deal mentioned in the article had been finalized this morning, likely while he was helping Lily find her matching socks. The steady and kind man from the night before suddenly felt like a character in a play she hadn't realized she was starring in. She wasn't just married to a stranger, she was married to the most powerful shadow in the financial world. The silence of the house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a heavy, suffocating lie. Christianah closed the laptop, the metallic snap echoing through the empty room like a gavel. He wasn't Victor. He had never been Victor. He was Alexander Vargas, and she was the only one left in the dark. The screen was still glowing when the back door creaked open, the familiar scent of rain and motor oil drifting into the kitchen. Alexander entered, wiping a smudge of grease from his knuckles with a rag. His expression relaxed until he saw her face. The air in the room instantly curdled, the domestic warmth of the last few weeks evaporating into a cold, clinical silence. Alexander Vargas, she said, the name feeling like a jagged piece of glass in her mouth. She didn't look at him, she looked at the laptop. The man who just moved $4 billion while I was worrying about the grocery list. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer a panicked excuse or a charming lie. He simply set the rag on the counter and stood tall, the Victor persona falling away like a shed skin. The man standing before her now possessed the terrifying, quiet gravity of the figure in the news photograph. "I was going to tell you," he said, his voice dropping into that low, resonant tone that suddenly sounded less like a humble consultant and more like a commander. But not like this. Why the charade? She finally looked at him, her eyes stinging with a mixture of betrayal and fury. "My father said he owed you a debt. He said you were a decent man of modest means. Did you pay him to lie to me? Did you buy a wife for $19 billion? "I didn't buy you, Christianah. I bought your father's silence," Alexander replied, his gaze unwavering. "The debt he told you about was a fantasy. The truth is that your father's firm collapsed months ago. He didn't just lose money, he committed fraud to cover the losses. He was days away from a prison sentence and total public disgrace when he came to me begging for a bailout. He offered you as collateral because I knew I needed a stable environment for Lily. Christianah felt the floor shift beneath her. The man she had spent her life trying to please had traded her like a used asset to cover a crime. "And you just accepted?" she whispered. "I accepted because I saw what that world was doing to you," Alexander said, taking a single step toward her, though he stopped when she recoiled. "My wealth destroyed my first marriage. It made my daughter a target before she could even walk. I built this life, this house, this name to give Lily a chance to grow up around people who aren't looking for a payday. I hid the money to protect her, but I kept the secret from you because I wanted to know if you could love a man who had nothing but a quiet life to offer." "You didn't give me a choice," she snapped, the hurt boiling over. "You traded one cage for another, Alexander. You just painted the bars to look like a home." The shadows in the kitchen seemed to lengthen, swallowing the domestic warmth they'd spent weeks building. The only light came from the small lamp over the stove, casting Alexander's face into sharp, unforgiving angles. He didn't look like the victor who fixed bicycles anymore. He looked like a man who had spent his life navigating the treacherous currents of absolute power. "You think I'm a monster for the lie," Alexander said, his voice barely a ripple in the heavy air. "And maybe I am, but I've spent a decade watching people's eyes change the moment they hear my name. The softness disappears, replaced by a calculating gleam. They start weighing my words against their own profit. They stop being people and start being negotiators." He stepped closer, the darkness of the room making the distance between them feel like a canyon. "I feared that if you knew, you would treat me with the same cold, practiced composure you used when you signed that marriage certificate. I didn't want a business partner, Christianah. I wanted to see if there was anyone left in that world who could look at a man and see a person, not a price tag." Christianah opened her mouth to argue, to scream that he had no right to test her, but the words died in her throat. She looked at him, really looked at him, and a cold, sickening clarity washed over her. He was right. She thought back to those first few days. If she had known he was Alexander Vargas, the man who held her father's life in his hands, she wouldn't have dared to be silent during the car ride. She wouldn't have laughed at Lily's blunt comments or allowed herself to focus on her textile designs. She would have been the daughter of the house, a perfectly polished, hollow shell, performing the role of the submissive wife to ensure the multi-billion-dollar debt remained settled. She would have spent every waking second calculating how to please him, how to navigate his moods, and how to protect herself from a man of his stature. She wouldn't have fallen for the man who made her coffee. She would have been too busy serving the man who owned her world. "You think I would have been different," she whispered, the realization tasting like ash. "I know you would have been," Alexander said, his eyes filled with a weary kind of sorrow. "Because that's what your father taught you. He taught you that love is a transaction and people are assets. I wanted to give you a few weeks where you were just a woman and I was just a man, and we were just a family." "But we aren't," Christianah said, her voice trembling as she backed away toward the hall. "We're a contract, Alexander, and I don't know how to live in a house where the walls are built out of 19 billion secrets." She turned and fled into the darkness of the hallway, leaving him standing alone in the dim light of a kitchen that no longer felt like home. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet of the previous weeks. It was a heavy, suffocating shroud. For 3 days, Christianah moved through the colonial house like a ghost, her footsteps light and her voice absent. She and Alexander occupied the same rooms like celestial bodies in separate orbits, their occasional glances charged with a tension that made the air feel thin. She spent hours walking the tree-lined streets of West Hartford, her coat pulled tight against a persistent, biting wind. Every modest house she passed, every manicured lawn and station wagon in a driveway, now felt like a question. She looked at the neighbors, people she had begun to recognize, and wondered if they were real, or if they were merely part of the elaborate, expensive stage set Alexander had constructed. But as her heels clicked rhythmically against the pavement, her mind kept drifting back to the small, unscripted moments. She weighed the $19 billion against the way he had instinctively adjusted the light for her sketches. She weighed the news headlines against the patient, unglamorous way he untangled Lily's hair after a bath. In her father's world, honesty was a luxury no one could afford. Every conversation was a chess move, every gift a hook. Yet, in this fake life, she had experienced more truth than in all her years at the Hensley estate. Victor, or Alexander, had never demanded her gratitude. He had never used his knowledge of her father's crimes to bend her to his will. He had been a man who simply noticed things. He had noticed her exhaustion, her talent, and her need for a cup of coffee in the morning. Was the deception a tool of control, or was it a desperate shield? She sat on a park bench watching a young father chase his toddler across the grass and realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't being told who to be. Even with the secret out, Alexander hadn't retreated into the cold authority of his boardroom persona to force her to stay. He had remained quiet, giving her the one thing her father never had, the agency to walk away. By the third evening, the weight of the billions began to feel less significant than the weight of the silence. She realized she was grieving not the loss of the man she thought he was, but the simplicity of the man she had allowed herself to become. She had been more herself as the wife of a struggling consultant than she had ever been as the daughter of a dynasty. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Christianah turned back toward the white colonial house. The secret was massive, but the 3 weeks of honesty were hers, and for once, they weren't for sale. The house was still when Christianah returned, but a single light burned in the dining room. Alexander was there, not with a ledger or a legal threat, but with a stack of papers and a fountain pen. He looked up as she entered, his expression guarded, waiting for the verdict she had been carrying through the neighborhood for 3 days. "I had my attorneys draft this," he said, pushing a folder across the table. His voice was steady, but there was a flicker of something raw in his eyes. "It's a dissolution of the original arrangement. It settles your father's accounts permanently, regardless of whether you stay. It also includes the seed funding and legal incorporation for your design firm. No strings, no oversight. You're free, Christianah. You don't have to be a debt anymore." Christianah looked at the documents. In her father's world, this was the ultimate victory, the moment where she finally owned her own life. But as she looked at the Alexander Vargas signature at the bottom of the page, she didn't see the billionaire who had bought her freedom. She saw the man who noticed the glare on her sketches and adjusted the blinds. She picked up the pen, but she didn't sign the dissolution papers. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out the business registration she had drafted herself during her long walks, the one she had intended to file before the secret broke. "I don't want your funding, Alexander," she said, her voice clear for the first time in days. "I'm going to build my business on my own terms, starting tomorrow. I've already secured a small line of credit based on my portfolio." Alexander's brow furrowed. "Then why are you here?" "Because $19 billion is just a number on a screen, but the man who makes sure I have sugar in my coffee before I even wake up is real." She stepped closer to the table. "I'm staying, not because of the contract my father signed, and certainly not because of the money you hide. I'm staying because for the last 3 weeks, you're the only person who treated me like I mattered more than the transaction." She reached out, her hand hovering over the table, until Alexander finally met her halfway. His grip was warm, solid, and for the first time, equal. Christianah took the pen and signed her own business contract, using the kitchen table as her desk. It was the first thing she had ever signed that wasn't a surrender. She looked at him, the ghost, the billionaire, and the man, and realized the arrangement was finally over. The choice, however, was just beginning. Outside, the world was still full of people who saw them as assets, but inside the quiet house in West Hartford, the lights stayed on, and for the first time, the air was clear. As Christianah chooses the man over the money, a new chapter begins. Not just for her business, but for a heart that finally found a home where it wasn't for sale. But in a world where everyone has a hidden identity, who can you really trust? If you enjoyed this journey from the cold estates of the Hensley family to the quiet warmth of West Hartford, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss a new story. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Would you be able to forgive a $19 billion secret, or is the lie too much to handle? Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are watching from. Thanks for being part of the story. I'll see you in the next one.